So things I'll use when I'm doing a thumb leather be some goat skin or whatever skin you're putting on the bow, a regular ballpoint pen to mark the leather. I'll have a simple scraper, Home Depot scraper. This happens to be one of my favorites. I'll have a couple extra blades on hand. I'll have a small ruler. I'll have some water and some paper towels handy for cleaning up any aliphatic resin. I'll have a box of toothpicks. I'll have my bench knife. I'll have my glass plate. I'll use some steel wool to clean up the wrap. Okay, so the first thing I typically do to remove the thumb leather is to soak it with some water, soak the leather with some water. That way, taking it off is easier and I'm less likely to damage the wrap. So I'm just gonna piece of paper towel around the thumb leather and soak the paper towel in water and just let that sit for 5 minutes or so and come back to it. The leather should be easier to take off or easier to remove from the stick. Now that I waited about 10 minutes or so, I'm gonna take this paper towel off of here and see if the glue has loosened up. And just like that, now this will come off pretty easily. Typically when we replace a thumb leather, we would like it to be 25 millimeters long, but that is constrained by the previous thumb leather. If you take a thumb leather off that's, way bigger than that and it's covering up, like for instance here we have a tinsel wrap, probably to meet a target weight for this bow. We're gonna have to do a big thumb leather to cover up this tinsel up to this silver wrap. We won't be able to get a 25 millimeter wrap on there. We're just gonna have to do a big one like the old one was. So now I'm gonna take some steel wool and I'm gonna clean up this silver wrap. Take a little bit more of that water and get some of this debris off of this tinsel. If you start with a smooth stick or wrap underneath of your thumb leather, you're gonna have a better looking thumb leather. Okay, so now that I'm kind of satisfied with the condition of the wrap underneath the thumb leather, or what's going to be the thumb leather, I'm gonna go ahead and start cutting out my thumb leather. So I'm gonna replace this thumb leather with goat. If you have a whalebone wrap, you might wanna use something like lizard or a thinner skin. If you have a really thick wrap, it might make sense to use something thinner than goat. So normally I have this like 30 millimeter wide pre-prepared roll of thumb leather. That's not gonna be wide enough for this one, so I'm gonna go ahead and get a fresh piece of skin. So here I've got some goat skin. I'm just gonna compare these two sizes and cut out a strip. Get rid of that. You're gonna wanna have your frog handy while you're doing your thumb leather. The thumb leather should come right to the end of the frog and just barely touch it. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put my first bevel in this thumb leather. I like to use disposable straight little scraping razor blades, and I like to have a fresh one for doing my bevels. So now that I've got a fresh razor blade on here, I'm gonna cut my first bevel. The longer your bevel is, in my experience, the easier it's gonna be to make your joints disappear where they overlap. Okay. So here I have a nice consistent line. I'd like this bevel to be a little longer, so I might take a little bit of this skin back here off, tidy this up. One way to tell that your seam is gonna look good with goat leather is to kind of put light behind the leather and look through it, and you should see little pores and little ridges from the skin. You actually want like a serrated looking edge to the goat skin. So I'm gonna put the beginning of the first seam, or the first cut that I made, on this part of the stick, because I want the seam to end opposite the thumb, because the thumb's gonna wear away the leather, and I want the thumb to wear away a part of the thumb leather that is not where the seam is. I'm gonna start by putting the first cut here, and I'm gonna wrap the skin around the stick, and I'm just gonna mark with a regular ballpoint pen roughly where my first cut ends on the inside of the skin. And now you can see I have a kind of a length. So an important part of this, to kind of get a gauge of how I want this cut to look to this length, I'll roll over the first cut. You want these two cuts to be parallel to each other. I'm gonna start on my line. I'm gonna bevel down the same way I did on the first cut. I'm gonna compare it against my first cut, see how parallel they are. Another thing I'm gonna look at when I fold these two lines together and check that they're parallel is see how these lines look. You can see here that this is way lower, and then it goes higher, and then this is even higher. So you want these cuts, the ends of the thumb leather, to be 90 degrees to your seam. And this is a way to check that by folding it over. I'm gonna make my first cut on the ends. The cuts aren't gonna be as long. So I'm gonna angle my razor blade up a little more, about 45 degrees, and cut down. This typically ruins the edge on the razor blades. I like to cut these seam chamfers, or I like to make these seam cuts first before I dull up this blade. That way I use about a blade per thumb leather. I'm gonna double check the length of this thumb leather by rolling it over the seam, just kind of pushing this down and seeing how it all hangs together. If I have a big lump underneath here, I know that the piece of leather is too long. And if the part where the seam is coming over, this section of the octagon, if the skin gets real thin there, I know that I cut my piece of leather too short. So I'll adjust my cuts accordingly by trimming off some leather or starting over on a new piece of leather. I'm gonna move on to making these cuts on the ends. I already made this cut. I'm gonna roll over the skin again until these seam lines are parallel. Once again, checking to see if these cuts on the end of the thumb leather are perpendicular to my first cut. And I can see there's still a little difference between the end of this here and the end of this here. And when it comes time to glue the leather up, that'll show up. So I'm gonna trim this some more by taking a little bit more leather off of the side that I could see from. I'm gonna line this cut up, and I'm gonna just take a little bit off of there, fold this over again until these two lines are parallel. And now I can see that these are the same length while this is parallel. I'm gonna check and see which one of these cuts I like better. This one isn't as, there's a little bit of a flat spot over here, which means the skin is slightly too thick. And instead of trimming this, I'm just gonna put this cut on the underside. This one that looks more serrated, I'm gonna put that part of the seam on the outside. So I'm gonna line this part of the seam up again. And since I want this seam to be on the outside, I'm gonna trim this side, making these cuts parallel to check and see how perpendicular this cut is. So after I've made this cut, that's gonna end up being the cut that touches the frog, just barely touches it. I'm gonna try to get this final cut, the fourth one over here, and when I cut it, I wanna cut it to the right length. So I'm gonna put the thumb leather right up here, and using the frog in the forwardmost position, check the leather and how it's gonna sit against the frog. Wrap it all the way around here, and then mark how long I want this. I'm gonna put my mark where I want the end of the bevel on the inside of the skin. So now I got this mark, I'm gonna make this cut. This cut's gonna be about 45 degrees, just like the one that's gonna be on the frog side of the leather, like so. And now I've got 4 cuts, and I'm just gonna double check the length and the width of the skin against the actual stick and make sure that I like all of that. I'm gonna put the skin here where it goes and wrap this around, checking to make sure that these seams and these ends of the cut come together nicely. And then I'm gonna go down to this side and check over here and see how the end of this looks. And you can see here that these are not the same length. This sticks out. I'm gonna take that material off, like so. Now to prep for gluing, I'm gonna get some glue. I'm gonna get my rubber band I'm gonna use to wrap the thumb leather onto the stick while the glue sets. I'm gonna have some paper towels nearby, a little bit of water to clean up any excess glue. This is aliphatic resin, also known as wood glue. Oh, I also want a toothpick handy. Any scooching or adjusting, I'm gonna wanna do that now. I'm also gonna check how the frog sits. It sits a little close, and the frog's pretty close to this piece of tape. I don't like this previous piece of tape, so I'm gonna replace it. Nothing too fancy for that step, just some painter's tape, the full length of my ruler, ending on the same facet that I started on. I think this will work. Now that I've changed this tape out, gonna try this one more time. And once I'm happy with all that and the position of the thumb leather on the stick and where the seam's gonna end up right here on this facet, I'm gonna push my non-dominant finger against the thumb leather to hold it in place. I'm gonna have my gluing rubber band ready to go and my cutting plate and my toothpick, where I'm gonna put a line of aliphatic resin down that's about the same width as the thumb leather. And I'm gonna take this toothpick and roll a little bit of this glue on here. Place it on this thumb leather, gently smooth this glue on here, getting some excess glue off. I want enough glue on here to glue down the ends of the thumb leather, but not so much that it squeezes out all over the place and makes a giant mess. I'm gonna roll that back over here, checking the position of the beginning of the thumb leather and the end of the thumb leather before I glue the rest of it down, scooching things around if I need to. Gonna check again at the end of the frog real quick, and then I'm gonna move to the other side and do the same thing on the opposite side of the thumb leather. Clean that up real quick with a little bit of water and my water paper towels that I've got handy. I'm gonna take one last little, I'm gonna roll the thumb leather over here, taking care to line this end up pretty nicely. Work my way down this seam. Once I'm done with that, I'm gonna take my rubber band that's cut, roll it over itself, and then roll the rubber band over the length of the thumb leather to kind of clamp it in place as the glue dries. I'm gonna let this sit for maybe 2 minutes. I don't wanna let it sit too long. Any spots like this, where the rubber band isn't fully covering the leather or any spots where the rubber band overlaps the next part of the wound rubber bands. If you leave this clamped up too long, those will show up in your thumb leather and it will be hard to get them out. So I don't like to leave this clamped up too long. And I'd say the glue is about halfway dry now, and I'm just gonna check in on here. I have a paper towel, I might get a little damp, and just roll the thumb leather in the direction that I wrapped it to kind of clean up any residue, any extra glue that's on here, and then wrap it again. And I'm gonna let the glue set up for another minute or so. I'm gonna take this rubber band off again. The ends of the thumb leather, typically, they like to come up a little bit, so I'll clamp those down with this rubber bands, taking care to leave this section in the middle kind of loose so it doesn't show up in the thumb leather, and wrap it tight again on the other side. So after letting that sit on the ends here a little bit, I'll take it off. I'm gonna check the ends here. So now I'm gonna tidy up this thumb leather a little bit. I'm gonna take my glass plate and another relatively flat thing, this wider ruler. I'm gonna roll the stick in between this ruler and this glass plate to flatten this thumb leather. I'm gonna take a little bit of kiwi shoe polish, and I'm gonna polish this leather like I would polish a leather shoe. I'm gonna clean this wrap one more time, and then I'm gonna check and make sure that this frog in the forwardmost position just barely touches. And now we have a new thumb leather for this Fretchner.